All right, so let's get started. Welcome to everybody. I can't see anybody, but welcome to everybody who's in already, and I hope some more people will be coming in. But I just wanted to say a few words, and I hope you'll grant me a few minutes to introduce someone who I think of as the most amazing scholar I know. And that's saying a lot, because I know a lot of amazing scholars, but he's the most amazing I know in terms of the totality of the depth of his insights, the breadth of his activities, and the sheer volume of work he has produced. Professor Nick Enfield is Professor of Linguistics at the University of Sydney and is inaugural director of the Sydney Social Sciences and Humanities Advanced Research Centre, and also inaugural director of the Sydney Centre for Language Research, and also head of the Sydney Initiative for Truth, and also a member of the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre and the Charles Perkins Centre. Professor Enfield is very much a public intellectual. Aside from hardcore academic stuff, he's very engaged in benefiting society through his academic work. The Sydney Initiative for Truth that I just mentioned and the Charles Perkins Center are interdisciplinary centers for improving society. The former, the Sydney Initiative for Truth, for understanding and remedying the post-truth crisis, largely created by Trump, I guess, and the latter about addressing lifestyle diseases, which is really an interesting thing, how our lifestyles lead us to have certain diseases and how humanities can have some effect in that regard. But this is actually interdisciplinary, so they work with medical people and everybody else. Professor Enfield is a fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities, or for the Humanities, of the Australian Academy for the Social Sciences as well, and of the Royal Society of New South Wales. He's a graduate of the Australian National University and the University of Melbourne, the two best universities in Australia. And his research on language, culture, cognition, and social interaction is empirically based, using data mainly from languages of mainland Southeast Asia, especially Lao. His 22 books, basically, he's written 2 per year recently, include the groundbreaking Ethnosyntax back in 2002, and then Linguistic Epidemiology, Linguistic Epidemiology in 2003, A Grammar of Lao in 2007, Relationship Thinking 2013, The Utility of Meaning in 2015, How We Talk 2018, The Concept of Action 2019, Getting Others to Do Things 2020, and The Languages of Mainland Southeast Asia, which just came out this year, plus his next book, due out also this year, What Languages Do to Us. These books and his 100+ articles cover a wide range of topics, and so he's a very interesting person to talk to. His talk today is entitled Moorings, the Role of Linguistic Practices in Linking Experience, Action, Identity, and Community. So take it away, Nick.
Well, thank you very much. And yeah, just an incredibly kind and overstated introduction about anyone. I'm very pleased to be invited and very grateful to you, Randy, for asking me to come and talk to this group. And, it's the oddity of giving the Zoom lecture is upon us, and I'll do my best. So hopefully you're seeing my screen that I'm sharing here, and as you've just heard, the talk is on something that seems really rather general, and I want to start out quite general and get into the specifics of the matter, and I'll link it to work that I'm currently doing in mainland Southeast Asia, and hopefully there'll be some issues that you're all keen to talk about. So there'll be, I believe, some chance for Q&A at the end. So yeah, thanks again for this generous introduction. So the title of the paper, includes the word mooring, and I kind of put this in at the very last minute, but I think that it helps to articulate via a kind of metaphor what it is that I'm interested in looking at. So what's a mooring? Well, a mooring is something that looks like this thing. It's a type of a fixed structure that you put in place. Typically, we think of moorings by the water, where you would tie a boat to that mooring so that it wouldn't go away. And one of the features of moorings is that, you know, you can leave and you can come back, and most importantly, multiple boats can come and attach themselves to this same kind of point of common, it's a common anchor. So that's kind of where the metaphor comes from. But to make it a little bit closer to the type of thing that I'm interested in looking at, here's another type of version of it. So this is a scene that you would see every day in a village in Laos. This is the way that people eat in Lao homes. So you have a tray table. This one's made of metal. They might be made of, you know, bamboo or other form of wood. So in a way, sort of similarly to the way the boats are tied to this single post by the water, these men are oriented to one and the same sort of anchor point, which in this case is the food that they're sharing. And of course, there's a lot of culture around the sharing of food, but what I'm interested in here is the sense in which these men are individuals who have their own private experience. They're eating this food, they're tasting the food. They have no real idea deep down as to whether the other person, you know, is experiencing exactly what they're experiencing, but they are coordinating around the same kinds of inputs, and they're building, you know, common meaning around what they're doing, including common experience of, you know, the exact things that they're currently experiencing. So in a sense, it's something like a tray table with food on it here is a mooring for these men who are kind of hooking themselves up to a common set of structures, set of experiences, and then using that in a certain way to build a relationship, to build a sense of agreement, and ultimately to build community. So it's really just a metaphor for language, and we'll sort of build that up as we go along. So this photo is taken in Laos, in an area where this was actually taken just around the new year in January, I think, in Laos. And it was just, you know, my last opportunity for a field trip. So I mean, January before last, so January 20, whatever the last year was, 2020. And, you know, of course, that's when COVID was already happening, but I was just there for at the last possible time. So I was grateful for that opportunity. So we'll come back to this area where this photograph was taken, but now I want to go into some sort of more general remarks about the real issue that I'm interested in. And I want to start with the example of déjà vu. So déjà vu is this quite curious phenomenon. The word is a word in English. Obviously, you know, it comes from French, but we learn it in English, and it refers to this strange sensation that what you're now experiencing is something that you've experienced in exactly the same way at some former time, maybe in a dream, maybe in a previous time. So imagine you see this cat walking past. Having déjà vu would be having this feeling that I've seen exactly that cat on exactly that carpet and by exactly those tangled cables. And what a strange feeling, because I know I've never experienced that. And when that happens, we say to the people with us, hey, I'm having déjà vu, this is weird. It causes this little interruption to our interaction, and then it's kind of gone. It doesn't really have any consequences. But what's interesting about it is that it gets us to make public a subjective experience that we're currently having, which is this weird feeling of déjà vu. Now, I thought, as somebody who learnt this word and expression and this speech routine and had this experience, I thought that this would be a universal human experience, that this was a kind of, you know, thing that happens to just all people. And on one occasion, I was talking to some people in Laos, and I wanted to know, well, how did they refer to that experience? So I didn't necessarily expect that they would have a word for déjà vu, but when I described the scenario to them, you know, this thing that happens, just as I described it, I totally assumed that they would know exactly what I was talking about. But to my surprise, people who I spoke to in Laos had no idea what I was talking about. They had no recognition of this experience of déjà vu. And this left me with this real mystery, was, you know, what is the status of déjà vu? Is that something that I've kind of constructed through experience? Is it something that Lao speakers actually have no correlate of? Is it that Lao speakers have some kind of funny feeling, but they never give shape to it because they never talk about it? So this sort of gives us an entry point into the thing that I'm interested in. It correlates to a distinction that's been made in anthropology and in psychology since, which is a distinction between what's called hypocognition and hypercognition. So what I was just describing, in that scenario, déjà vu in English would correlate to a kind of hypercognition, which means that in the community of speakers that I was socialized into, we've discriminated this experience of déjà vu. We've concretized it. We've brought it into our awareness, and we've given it this shape. And indeed, we've also given it this label, and we have this speech routine around it. But in the case of Lao, those things haven't happened. And it may be that Lao speakers have some corollary experience, but it isn't hypercognized, it's what's called hypocognized. So there's that distinction between hypocognition, which is kind of, you know, buried in some sense or not realized in some sense, and hypercognition. So from the data where that's actually, from the research, rather, the literature where that's been articulated, that's not from, you know, déjà vu hasn't been discussed there, but it really came out of discussions around the emotions. So take the English word sadness. You know, this is thought to be one of the basic emotions. It's thought to correlate with, you know, a universal human emotion, and English speakers have a fairly clear sense of what sadness refers to and when you might expect someone to be sad. But now, some time ago, already in the 1970s, in Levy's ethnography of Tahiti, he has this discussion about sadness and says, you know, there isn't a concept of sadness for Tahitians. And he is actually the one who introduced this terminology of hyper and hypocognition. So he said, you know, sadness is hypercognized for English speakers, but in Tahiti, people, when, for example, a loved one passes away, they will feel funny. It's not like they don't have any reaction to that, but they won't report any sort of concrete description of what they're experiencing. So they might say they're not feeling well, they're ill, but they wouldn't have this sort of, you know, very hypercognized kind of notion. So it's the emotion domain where this concept came from. But I want to say that, or I want to apply this idea to kind of inner experiences more generally. So another example would be the experience of taste. So take, for example, this dish that you see being prepared and served here, which is a papaya salad, frequently eaten as a snack in Laos and Thailand. So as you can see, this particular dish is going to be incredibly spicy because it's full of raw chilies. Now, the word jang in Lao, which is written there, that is a taste term which is typically translated into English as bland. Now, if you were to eat this, you know, if you were to give this food that you see on the screen to, you know, your average English speaker, they would not say that it was bland. Bland in English really means it has sort of no taste really at all. Jang is something much more specific than that, and it means that it's not salty enough. So if you talk to Lao speakers, if you give them something which an English speaker would call bland, they would say, yeah, it's jang, so like a very thin soup or something like this. But Lao speakers can also taste an incredibly spicy dish like this one and discern that it's lacking salt. Whereas, just speaking for myself, you know, I just can't detect that at all because I'm completely overpowered by the spices. So we can model in the sort of hypocognition distinction, we can model that difference there and say that for Lao speakers, they've hypercognized this concept, this very specific kind of flavor sensation of not having enough salt, independent of all the other strong tastes that may exist. Whereas for me as an English speaker, I have never discriminated that particular experience. I don't have a way of talking about it. I mean, obviously I can use words to talk about it, by saying, for example, it needs more salt, but it's not a conventionalized term. But more importantly, it's not that it's just not a conventionalized term, it's also something that, you know, I cannot detect the same perceptual experience that Lao speakers, in my experience, can reliably detect and agree on. So there's this general question that arises around the hypocognition distinction, and that is that when some kind of inner sensation becomes hypercognized in a particular community, the question is it that people in that community are seeing an experience and giving a name to it? That is, you know, you point to an experience and say, oh, you know, that feeling when X happens, or, you know, that feeling when Y happens, that's the thing I'm talking about. That would be the first possibility, is that you just show a concept or an experience to a person and then give it a label. That would be hypercognizing. The other possibility, which I'm proposing here, and which I think is clearly, you know, has to be the case, is that when we hypercognize some impression, some sensation, what we're doing is we're really forming something up. We're really creating something or building something that correlates to something that's sort of socially shared with others. And this is sort of the puzzle that I want to get into today, and that is that individuals who are having these first-person experiences need to build a conception of what this particular percept or concept is, corresponding to the terminology like deja vu or sad or what have you. But also that perception or that concept needs to be shared across the whole community. And the question I want to raise here is, how does this get done? So now let me just pop out of that kind of general overview of the interesting question I want to propose here and go to the context for asking about this. So at the moment, I'm involved in a project which is funded by the Australian Research Council, and I'm working with my co-author, Chip Zuckerman. I apologize for not mentioning earlier that Chip is a co-author on this study. So he is a postdoc on this project, and he's worked together with me doing field work in this area. And we have some PhD students, and we've been doing quite a bit of field work on there, looking at doing grammatical descriptions, but also looking at the inter-social and inter-ethnic relationships among people in this group. So the area is in the red circle you see here on the map. It's just inside the border of Laos and Thailand, about 300 kilometers due east of the capital of Laos, Vientiane. So if we zoom in, it's the area that you can see with all the red dots and the village names here. It happens to be in a protected area, which is a whole set of villages in the watershed of a major hydroelectricity dam project. So you can actually see the dam, the blue area in the bottom left of the screen. But for our purposes, what's important here is that there are many languages spoken in this area, not just one. And in fact, Lao is hardly spoken at all. There are several minority languages spoken in there. Cree, spoken by about 500 people. Sak, spoken by about 1,000 people. Bru, which is spoken also outside this area, but spoken by a larger number of people. And then a lot of Vietnamese being spoken in there because they're near the border with Vietnam. And also Lao, of course, being spoken there because it's in Laos. There's a lot to be said about the language situation there, which I don't have time to say. The one thing that I'm going to focus on now is an idiom that circulates within that area, within all of those language communities. And in Lao, the idiom is written here, as you see, siang nak siang bao, which means heavy sound, light sound. If in the order of the morphemes, it's sound heavy, sound light. Here's how it sounds.
Siêng nặng siêng bầu. Siêng nặng siêng bầu. Siêng nặng siêng bầu. Siêng nặng siêng bầu. Siêng nặng siêng bầu mình. Siêng nặng siêng bầu. Tăng vô bên siêng nặng siêng bầu. Siêng nặng siêng bầu. Mình bị siêng nặng siêng bầu. Siêng nặng siêng bầu. Tại mình siêng nặng siêng bầu chứ. Siêng nặng siêng bầu là. Siêng nặng siêng bầu. เสียงหนักเสียงเบานี่มันมีเสียงหนักเสียงเบาหนักเบาเสียงหนักเสียงเบา
So as you can hear, you know, we have ample examples of this little phrase in our recordings. That was a sort of a, you know, supercut provided by my co-author Chip Zuckerman. So this expression "siang nak siang bao" is something that we hear constantly when we're having conversations, which of course is our business in the watershed in these villages, when we're having conversations about the languages and about how words are pronounced. So it's essentially a metalinguistic term about how words sound. So, you know, the relevance of this for everything I've been saying so far is that people are using this term to denote a particular kind of sound, a particular audible impression, a particular, you know, percept, if you like. But it goes a little bit kind of deeper than that. So the second thing I want to just note is that I gave you examples of people saying this expression in Lao. The expression is calqued exactly in other languages, other varieties of languages that are spoken in the area. So for example, in two different dialects of Cree, here's how it sounds in Cree Dun dialect, Cree Pong dialect, in Bru, in Sak, and in Lao. Right. So you might be asking, well, what does this expression really refer to? Heavy sound, light sound. Well, if we just focus now on the Cree language that I've been working on, one of the things that Siang Nak Siang Bao captures is the distinction between one register and another register. So these are often actually called in descriptions of these languages heavy and light register. But I'm just labeling them register 1 and register 2. Just for time, I won't go through all of these, but let's first just look at the top pair here. So you see these two words that, you know, in the slashes, you see the segments are identical. It's a j followed by a long vowel e, followed by an n and a glottal stop. But the difference is that you have register 1 and register 2. So this affects the way these two words sound. It's a classic kind of minimal pair. So the difference is going from left to right. Jin, 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 jin. Going to, let's just take the last example again. Ru, 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 ru. So you've got differences. These are kind of classic phonation type differences where you've got a bundle of sound features which include different phonation, sort of breathy phonation versus clear, and also differences in things like whether the pitch is falling or not falling. The plot thickens when you look at the what we call the terminants of words in this language. So again, we're looking at Cree here. So you've got the two registers are in the two columns there, but then you look at the 3 rows, you've also got a distinction in what we call terminants, which is to do with how the syllable ends. So just in register 1, you've got a minimal triplet here with these 3 words, first with a glottal stop ending, then with a voiced ending, then with a devoiced ending. So it's doi, doi, doi. In register 2, ra, ra, ra. So that gives you this kind of logical structure in the phonology of the 6 cells, 2 registers in the columns, and 3 terminants values in the rows corresponding to the shape of what I just showed you. And that, in fact, maps exactly onto the 6-cell structure of the Vietnamese tone system. So the Cree language is in fact a Vietic language. It's closely related to Vietnamese, but it has undergone, you know, none of the radical changes that Vietnamese has undergone over the last 10 centuries or so. But the point here is that the 2 languages would be described as being a phonation type register language in the case of Cree, and a tone language in the case of Vietnamese. And that implies that they have a different kind of phonological system, and that different kinds of sounds are responsible for the distinction between them. So I want to imply that it's wrong to call them two different kinds of systems, because in fact they both have features of both pitch, contour, and phonation type differences and things like checked finals and so forth. And in fact, it's received knowledge in this part of the world that there isn't really a clear distinction between tone systems and register systems. So if you look at a kind of a textbook definition of a tone language, it often will state that pitch alone is what constitutes a distinction between words. But as we've known for a long time, as in this quote from Eugenie Henderson, pitch is only one phonetic component of tone. Very often there are other features besides pitch, such as intensity, duration, voice quality, final glottal constriction, as I've just been suggesting. So more recently, Brunel and Kirby here saying distinguishing phonation and tone is neither typologically nor diachronically useful. So the point I want to make here is that you've got this idiom, this phrase that circulates in these communities where they're talking about a distinction between words in heavy versus light, which is not a very precise distinction. It's a distinction that is applied in a range of ways. In fact, we published last year, we published a descriptive paper about what all those usages precisely are. But the point is that it captures something about the perceptible difference in across words within and across these languages. So it falls within the category of things that are hypercognized, and in this case, it has to do with the impressions of sound. So the puzzle I want to talk about today has to do with this particular abstract perceptual category that's been hypercognized across the Num-Noi area, and I want to ask, what is the causal mechanism by which this category is constructed by individuals and calibrated across them? So I won't be really dwelling on the specific details of the heavy sound, light sound case itself, although we'll come back to it as an illustrative example. What I've been focusing on in working together with Chip Zuckerman on this paper is trying to think about what would be the key kind of causal mechanisms by which an individual would go from, for example, being a child who doesn't yet speak the language to being a functioning member of society who has a percept that corresponds to this expression, xiang nak xiang bao. Or just as we could ask the same question about someone who has a functioning percept corresponding to a word like sad or, or bland. So the big sort of problem here that I'll spend more time on, and there's going to be two other small pieces before we finish, but the one where I'll spend a little bit more time is this part, which is the question really of word meaning and how a person builds a word meaning when it has to do, when the meaning of that word is a kind of a first person percept. So recall the way I set up this problem today is, a person has to build a sense of what a word means, but at the same time, it needs to calibrate with what other people in the society also feel. So I'm using the terminology of Saussure here and saying, okay, what we're interested in is signifier to signified relations, where the signifier is, the word itself. So it would be sadness or heavy sound, light sound, that idiom. And the signified is whatever that, whatever object, whatever concept that particular word points to. And people need to build up that relationship, and they need to fill in the content of that word if they're going to be able to use it and understand it in their community. So I'm going to talk about 5 forces, if you like, that play a role in allowing people to establish this relation. So the first one is called stigmergy. And that is, this term is actually used for talking about the behavior of creatures like termites that build these incredibly complex and large, architectural wonders, these termite nests. They do it in a coordinated way, just in the same way that fish can swim in a coordinated way, and certain birds can fly in coordinated ways, and ants can do things in coordinated ways. But they use this principle of stigmergy, which is a principle whereby the individual termites don't need to know the structure of the whole nest. They're not working to a blueprint. What they're doing instead is that they're taking cues from the traces of other individuals' behavior. So in the ants, the termite nest case, the termites, one termite will act in a certain way and another termite will see the products of their action. So it will be some structure that they observe inside the nest. And then just based on that structure, then they will know what to do next. So in human life, we have a very well-known example of this, and that is the so-called desire path. That is the path that people create when they cross a certain area of lawn, because that's the most direct path, and then you just walk across it, and by footsteps, over and over time, you actually beat down a path. Now, the interesting thing about this path, it's an example of stigmergy in human life. The trace of other people's behavior serves as a sign to us for us to then act in that same way. So you see that path that's just created by people's feet, and it does two things. One thing is it gives you the idea of walking across there if you hadn't have thought of it, and it gives you permission to walk across there if you had thought maybe you weren't allowed to. So it's a signal to us that was not put there necessarily by people wanting to give us a signal, but it serves that function. So I want to give you a quote from a book by Roger Brown, who was a famous social psychologist who looked at how children learn their first language. And he didn't use this term stigmergy, but he described something that I want to say follows this same principle. So he says, if a biology professor in his first lecture uses the word coelenterate, he establishes an empty category to be filled in later. So he's taking the point of view of his students who have never heard this word coelenterate. Suddenly they recognize this is a word in the language, and it's an empty category. Oh, we've got to fill it in. So continuing the quote, it's empty in the sense that nothing is signaled by the unfamiliar word except the existence of a category. The professor's new word functions as a lure to cognition. So this is the real key here. He was really talking about not college students, but about children learning their first language. As soon as they've recognized that a word is a word, then they've got this kind of game. They've got to fill in what that word means so that it grabs onto them. It gives them a puzzle to solve. And this lure to cognition attracts their thought and actually gets them started on this process of wanting to fill in the meaning of that word. So this is a sort of first step, is that when words circulate, they don't just convey meaning, they actually motivate us to fill in that category and to do something that other people are doing, which is to build that category. Now, the second kind of force in this process is, so the first force in this process was to get people kind of started on the path of building a meaningful sign based on other people's behavior. But they don't want to just build any old meaning for that sign. They want to build a meaning for that sign that's the same as everyone else's. They don't want to be using a completely idiosyncratic version of the sign. And that may be because they don't want to stand out, that they have an orientation to norms for pure conformity, or because they, there's obviously a functional payoff of working with the same categories that other people work with. So in any case, we have a very deep-seated orientation to norms and wanting to conform. So you can see it anywhere you want, but an example would be, in places like fashion, where there's no rule that these young men have to wear their hair like that, but they choose to do so. And a lot of their, people in their subculture would choose to do so. And any of you who are familiar with Metallica would know that, they caused a lot of confusion in the 90s when they all got short haircuts and nobody quite knew what to do about it. But anyhow, so orientation to norms is crucial. And it gives people a motivation, not just to fill in a category and build one up, but to build one up which is mindful of how other people in the group take it to mean, right? So it's not just what does this word mean, it's what do people think this word means. All right. So we're sort of now continuing on the theme of how do people converge on having a similar meaning, because, you know, in this case that we're talking about internal impressions and internal sensations that others don't have the opportunity to. I mean, I can't see what you're experiencing. So the third principle here is what I'm going to call cumulative angulation. And this is basically, you know, triangulation is another way of putting it. So let's just go by analogy with this basic kind of principle of triangulating information in order to derive new information. So you might be standing there looking at a mountain in the distance. You don't know where you are. You know how high the mountain is, but so how do you figure out how far away you are from the mountain? Well, you can't do it just by knowing how high it is. You need some third piece of information, which is the angle of that corner of this triangle here, so that you can then calculate how far away it is. And that's, you know, a basic principle of what's called triangulation. You've got to get a certain minimum number of different angles on something in order to get a more reliable sense of, you know, of what it is you're trying to figure out. So let me give you an example from my fieldwork in this area. So when I was working, you know, in the first couple of years on the Cree language, I was doing a lot of lexical work and taking down word meanings. And this word went into my notes, bajai. And we were sitting in the house, and the word, I noted the word down and asked my language teacher, what does this word mean? And he pointed out onto the veranda here. You know, there's a man standing on this veranda. You can see the surface that he's standing on. So the person pointed to that surface and said, that's Pachoi. So I wrote down in my book, Pachoi is veranda. Now that is, you know, one data point, right? Just what this fellow pointed to. So then the next day we're out walking and he sees these lengths of bamboo poles and says, there, that's Pachoi. You asked me about Pachoi yesterday. And that gave me this second angle on the thing that I was filling in. So when you go back to this point, you know, this is Roger Brown's kind of lure for cognition, that I've got this word, now I'm trying to fill it in and I'm collecting data points. As soon as I got my second data point, I had to revise. I thought, well, okay, hang on. I don't think it means veranda anymore. Maybe it means, you know, these beams that are used for construction. Well, then soon after, we're traveling around on the riverside and someone points to this stand of bamboo plants and says, you know, there, you see, that's Pachoi. We were talking about Pachoi. So, you know, getting this cumulative angulation over time allows you to get a much more sharper image of something that you're trying to construct. And of course, all the people in your community are getting, so I mean, you know, I'm giving you an artificial case of a language learner like myself, but for children, of course, they're seeing in the wild this diverse range of references. So the point about cumulative angulation is that people in the community are getting exposed to a similarly diverse range of uses of a word or an expression, and that gives them comparably diverse data points, which allows the image that they're trying to construct to become sharper. So a fourth force here is attentional asymmetry, and this is simply the idea that we have similar perceptual systems for which certain things will stand out more saliently than other kinds of things. So you just look at a visual scene like this one, something stands out amidst all the other things. Similarly with, you know, the living, you know, with, for example, sounds, certain things will stand out more in our perception of language. Certain parts of the word will be more salient to us. So this is a principle that was put forward by Brent Berlin, talking about the native categorization of plants and animals by people in traditional societies. And he was trying to understand the puzzle of why do people name the plants and animals that they name. And he said, well, the reason is, so here's a quote, In the categorization of plants and animals by peoples living in traditional societies, there exists a specifiable and partly predictable set of plant and animal taxa that represent the smallest fundamental biological discontinuities easily recognized in any particular habitat. So he was arguing that the natural world, the perceptible world, has this structure that he said stands out as a beacon for us, and that structure is a match for our perceptual systems. So that to the extent that humans share their perceptual systems, they're going to have similar experience of the prominence of certain features of experience. So here in this fourth force around sort of building signified joinings, you've got this principle that says that more perceptually prominent features will be anchors for concept formation. And then there's finally one more principle here, which is leading to convergence of these kind of inner experiences, if you like, and that's what's called verbal overshadowing. So let me explain to you what I mean. Verbal overshadowing is an effect of language use, and it comes from when you have a category for some experience, let's say a visual experience, like how somebody's face looks or something, anything that you've seen. If you categorize or talk about that, what you're seeing, the words overshadow the specifics of the experience, and you begin to lose your memory and your access to the specific perception that you had, in following the principle of what categorization basically is, which is throwing away data, throwing away information. So here's something from a study by Gary Lupien in 2008. So this was a psychological study where he showed people these pictures on the computer screen of chairs and lamps. And he had them do various different kinds of tasks. So some people actually had to just categorize these things, press a button if it's a chair, press another button if it's a lamp. Other people had a completely unrelated task, and it was just, say if you think it's, if you like it or you don't like it, something that didn't involve actually categorizing the object as a chair versus a lamp. So later on, when you show people arrays of, chairs and lamps, the people who named those chairs or categorized those chairs as chairs are worst at remembering afterwards whether they've seen that specific chair before in the original test, and the same with the lamps. So the conclusion, and this has been shown in other kinds of studies, for example, of whether you remember seeing a face in a video clip, if you describe it with words, you actually strip away information. So this is the final. I'm not saying these are exhaustive, by the way. These are just, forces that we're beginning to sort of build a list of these forces. And this is one of them. The effect of verbal overshadowing is that once you begin to categorize an experience, you actually are stripping away the details of that experience whenever you're using that categorization. And one of the effects that has is it makes you more likely to converge with others, since there are fewer details on which you might differ with others on the on what that experience or what that concept actually contains. So these are the sort of 5 forces that I want to argue explain convergence among individuals in the construction of these conventional percepts and concepts. First, the way that words invite us to form categories. Second, the incentive to conform and seek what we think everyone would agree on about those categories. Third, building evidence from diverse data points to get more specific about what a word would refer to. Fourth, being guided by asymmetries in our perception. And then finally, once naming becomes frequent, then actually simplifying those concepts across the group. And these are 4 forces that apply or should apply equally to people across, roughly equally to people across a community. Hence, helping to give rise to convergent understandings of what are essentially highly subjective experiences. So that ends the kind of main section of what I wanted to talk about in relation to the mechanisms that we're beginning to explore that taken together allow people to hypercognize experience. But there's two more points that I want to make, and I'll be much more brief with these before we finish. And that has to do with affordances that words have. So let me explain what I mean here. The task for someone who's learning a word or an expression that correlates to some kind of internal, experience is not only to figure out what is that internal experience, what is that object that's pointed to by the word. Not at all, because that's the signified. The signifier itself is also a tool that people use in interaction for certain reasons, right? They're not simply randomly referring to experiences that they have. The case of déjà vu is actually interesting because it's a bit hard to understand why people actually tell other people that they're having déjà vu, because nothing really follows from it. But let me give you examples where I think things really do follow from it. So we can ask, how did a person learn what a word stands for? But then we can ask, what did they learn about what I can do with that word? So returning to Levy's work on the emotions in Tahiti, he had this nice phrase saying that feelings are motives for action. And he talked about how different kinds of feelings in Tahitian discourse are often presented as explanations of action. So people are not simply pointing to an experience they happen to be having for no reason, right? So he gave the example of this term feel, which means something like tired or fed up or bored or annoyed. It's a sort of a culturally specific emotion that he described. And he pointed out that when people use this word, they're often doing it in order to signal that something's going to happen next, so that they're going to stop what they're doing, or they're breaking off a relationship, or they're leaving a job or something like that. So the point here is to say not only what does the word mean, but what can I do with that word? Why would I want to have that word as a tool in interaction? So in terms of emotions, this is something that's been pointed out before. So Will's here saying that a word is a node in a classification system, but it's also a tool for doing things. So returning to the emotion of sad, you don't just say that someone's sad, you say it for a reason. So you might be predicting what they're going to do, or you might be justifying something that they've done, or you might be excusing something that they've done. There might be or you might be trying to convince someone to do something for them. There's a whole lot of speech acts that would be helped along by invoking this concept of sadness. And that's a key piece of what people also want to learn when they're building these signs. Also, now coming back to the case of the taste, you don't just randomly say that papaya salad lacks salt, right? The reason why you're going to say that is because you want to prompt someone to add more salt to it, or you want to essentially get their permission or get their go-ahead for you to add the salt to it. So there's a quite a practical connection between the experience and then what would follow from the experience, and you can only coordinate around that subsequent action if you have a word like that for doing that. So this is a very clear way in which the word meanings are tied to cultural practices, because you need the word meanings if you're going to coordinate around certain kinds of courses of action. So on this point, when we just think about what people do, I haven't really said anything about what people do with this expression of heavy and light, siang nak siang bao, that we discussed, that I've been discussing. And that is, I'll say a few things about what people do with that term. We, of course, encounter this term over and over and over in the context of second language learning. Now, our business in the field is second language learning. That's what we do from kind of morning till night. And so people are constantly using whatever meta-linguistic terminology they can muster up. And this is one of their go-to expressions, which means it could mean anything from a very specific reference to something like a minimal pair contrast, or it could be a bit vaguer, saying, you know, you've got to pronounce it differently, you haven't got the pronunciation right. So it's a prompt when people are trying to help others in learning a second language. It also might be a way of critiquing or a way of kind of mocking someone who isn't able to speak a second language very well. Or third, it may be a way of sharing interest with others in the variation and the differences in language forms. So let me just elaborate on that for a second. People in this part of the world, in this particular area, but also more generally, and I think probably everywhere in the world, but certainly here, people love talking about the languages that are around them. Here in this place, people are very multilingual. They're very keen to learn other languages that are spoken in their area. They're very keen to, you know, discuss them. There's not a lot of intolerance. There's basically, you know, they're very tolerant of each other's languages and very happy to hear each other's languages being spoken. So there's a kind of celebration of different languages in this area. So it's often the case that people are sharing their interest in variation around language, not just different languages, but also different varieties. So upstream, downstream, they speak different from us, and they might use the heavy light distinction to characterize that. And I just emphasize in that last bullet point there that for this particular function, the distinction between, let's say, pitch and phonation, which I talked about earlier on, which is actually not made by this heavy light contrast, it doesn't make a difference for this particular case, exactly because the languages conflate pitch and phonation in many kinds of ways. So that's the sort of, the second big piece there is that the effects that signs have provide a motivation for agents, that is for language learners, for people who speak these languages, to learn what, not just what these things refer to, but what you can do with them, how you can wield these signs in you know, social interaction, and specifically for coordinating around certain courses of action. And that, I think, is where the moorings metaphor really comes in, is that, you know, also with the whole earlier, the first section, you know, people are really coordinating around something that's common, that allows them to build up something more firm and more significant. So then finally, and in this case, again, just briefly, there is kind of related, pretty closely related to the action point, but it's more about identity. And that is, when people learn a word, they may be able to use that word to show something about themselves and to display something about themselves, rather than merely, you know, contribute to a course of action or refer to something. So in the domain of, you know, first-person perceptions, a good example is from people talking about the taste of wine. So you can go online and look at wine commentary, and you can find people saying things like, you know, when they taste this particular wine, it has aromas of rich dark currants, nectarine skins, gushing blackberry, lots of fragrant tobacco, blah, 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 charred herbs and pencil shavings. So it's a, you know, this is a fascinating and now I think well-studied area of, you know, the language of perception. And what I'm interested in here, of course, is more the sense in which somebody who uses language like what you see on the screen here, they're not just describing something, and maybe somebody who's uncharitable to wine journalists might say they're not really describing anything. What they're doing is signaling about themselves and about their expertise and about their access to perceptions that other people don't have access to. And I do say that that's, you know, uncharitable precisely because, you know, this theory of hypercognition suggests that, yeah, if you do have a language of talking in that way, then it's highly likely, all things being equal, that you may have thereby built a certain sensitivity and a certain discrimination. So it's a, you know, it's an interesting empirical question, but the point still remains that you may be referring veridically to some experience with a word, but you also may be signaling about yourself. So we certainly see with the usage of this reference to heavy light in the sounds of the languages that people in our field area are oftentimes showing that they're well traveled, showing that they have expertise. And part of the evidence for that is that, you know, the more people, it's not exclusively men who use this expression, but it's predominantly men who use this expression, and men who are, let's say, better traveled. So, you know, it's true that men travel more in this part of the world. It's true that they spend more time outside of their home village, and it's true that they are more proficient in you know, in languages other than their native language. So, you know, that also then will correlate to their expression of expertise through using this heavy light expression. And it's one way in which they can kind of position themselves within their community as somebody who knows more about the languages of the general area. So what I've tried to kind of explicate here is a model of, I mean, essentially language learning, but not just sort of learning your first word, but a longer term kind of construction of a very situated conception of what a word might mean or what an idiom might mean. The model here includes, you know, taking a word or an expression as a lure for cognition, as Roger Brown put it, and building through whatever means you can and whatever data you can get a concept that's going to converge with what others have, but at the same time using it as a lure for action, a lure for identity, as a lure for coordinating with others around some kind of common concept. And I want to argue that that is, you know, not just something that links to the heavy sound, light sound expression we're interested in here, or any of the other perceptual categories we've been talking about, but any signified concept in a language is going to have these different affordances and these different potential motivations for people to build those concepts in the way that they do. So to come back to the original kind of question about hypercognition versus hypocognition and that process of hypercognition, I certainly don't see it as a process of simply seeing something that you weren't seeing or noticing something you weren't noticing and sticking a label on it. It's a much more complex, socialized, public mediated process of creating and forming up that more discriminated concept, and doing so in a way you know, that's veridical and that matches with what other people have, but that is also socially useful. So the conclusion then, based on all of that, is that you know, we want to view linguistic practices as moorings in terms of this metaphor I've been developing, that we really hang on to a kind of a common anchor point, and our very subjective or first person experiences, along with all of our other things we might refer to, but even those most subjective experiences can become hypercognized and shared by means of this range of forces in concert that link perception, action, identity, and community. So I'll leave it there, and thank you very much for your attention. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Nick. That's fantastic. That's really very helpful. It was clear and very helpful. In fact, from my own personal perspective, I've been talking for many years that our understanding of language is on an individual level is very subjective, but I could never really understand how, although I think that's true because we infer our language from our experiences, I didn't really think about, okay, then how do we get to the point where we actually can talk to other people? If everyone has individual experiences, how does it we do have some common ground? Where is that mooring like you're talking about? So this is really fantastic. This is really fills a big gap in our knowledge base about, you know, how these kind of things happen. So
Thank you.
But I wouldn't say it's a one-time thing. I'm sure you're not saying that either, that it's a continual thing. And I don't know if you know the work of Daniel Casasanto, but he's been saying something different, similar to what I was saying. But it's he says that all concepts are ad hoc. In other words, you're constantly inferring from the actual interactions you're having in the context that you're in, the meaning that the person is intending or the meaning that you are intending in that particular context. That there isn't there is, of course, like you said, a mooring, some kind of shared something or other in there, but the concept itself is constantly changing, and as our experiences, because if it arises from the inferring the meaning from our or in our use of it also, as you said in part two, it's our use of it also is kind of, what can we do with this? So all of these come from our experiences, which and so our experiences are constantly changing, and so then our uses and our understanding of these things is constantly changing as well. And I think that's what Daniel Casasanto means. I can send you a link to his he gave a talk on this just last week actually. But
That would be great.
but would you agree with that?
Yeah, let me just ask first, should I stop sharing this screen?
No, well, it's up to you. Yeah, if you want to have more people on the screen in a minute, we can open up
maybe
the
I'll just
question.
do that because then I can
Okay,
see.
good. Now we can see some people. Okay, good. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess I want to say that I'd agree with that. I mean, I certainly don't believe that you set up a concept in your mind and then stick to it, but I do think that there's a lot of inertia. So, humans
Habit.
work with, and I mean, there's something more specific than just habit, and that is that we operate in terms of confirmation bias. So we come up with hypotheses about what is going on in any situation, and we don't actually try to falsify it. We just look for responses that are in line with what we assume, and then as long as we don't get sort of contradicted in our beliefs, we just happily carry on thinking that that our version of, let's say, the word meaning is the right one, or it's the one that everyone else has. So that means that there's a lot of leeway for never discovering that other people have a different conception to what you have, because the differences are never made public, and you never go out of your way to explore those differences or test them. We don't treat language like scientists, or like good scientists might, as language users. So in that sense, I say we can definitely revise, and sometimes we do realize that people have different word meanings from ours, or we might move to another country and we have to adjust because we realize that people in this new country use that word in a new way. So in a sense, I'm not sure if that helps to answer your question. I guess I'm just addressing the matter of whether you would change your perception of a word. The other thing I guess I would comment on in what you said is that there's a difference, obviously, between the category that you build up of a word sort of as a convention in your community versus the interpretation of the use of that word on a particular occasion. This is, and I think it's fairly well established, but I know it's not entirely uncontroversial. But I subscribe to the model that says you build a kind of what Peirce might have called a leggy object, a kind of a meaning of a word that is sort of like Frege's sense. It captures the general community understanding of what that word means in the abstract. But every time it's used in concrete contexts, of course, you're looking for the intention behind the speaker's utterance of the word in that context, and then that's when we apply, our implicatures, and that's when we enrich the understanding through our inferential process and so on. So yes, I agree, but I think underlying it, I do think there's, a fairly stable set of understandings that we have for words and their meanings.
Okay, good. Okay, we can open it up. We have a couple of comments already, I think. Dodo says, thanks for the great talk.
The photo is not from the Matrix. The photo is not from, I can see the comments here. The photo is not from the Matrix. The photo is from just Keanu having a sandwich in New York one day. It's a paparazzi photo.
Okay. So if you can see the comments there, then maybe you could just answer them, or if you want to have the person ask, we can ask them to unmute and ask. But some of them are just. So Dodo says, thanks for the great talk and inspiring analysis of the cultural concept heavy sound, light sound. Besides that, I noticed 2 black cats in your slides. May I know the idea of black cat? in Lao community.
Sure. No, there's actually nothing that I know of that's sort of specific to black cats. I mean, in my own community, suburban Australia, you know, we talk about how a black cat walking in front of you is bad luck. But I've never encountered that in Laos. Houses across Laos have cats living in them. You know, they kind of belong to the family. They're not very, there aren't really special sort of beliefs around cats particularly. People just seem to like having them around. And yeah, Jesse's question about the black cat, that's indeed from the famous deja vu scene in the
right, where they're talking about deja vu there. I also wanted to ask you this hypocognition and that would you talk about that not just on a societal level but on an individual level? Because like you mentioned wine, and I remember my father he would say, oh, all wines taste alike. All of that's nonsense what people say about wine. But yet if you were talking about coffee, oh no, for him then coffee, you have really very big differences, and he was very particular about coffee. So he was kind of hyper cognition, you know, these concepts for coffee, but he just didn't have them for wine. I mean, he just didn't make the same distinction.
I agree, and I think there's a lot of, you know, it's an important point because it points to quite significant kind of experiential diversity within communities.
Right.
So, and it's related to practice and coordination of practice. So, for example, in the literature about, you know, people's knowledge of the natural world. So, you know, we know from surveys by anthropologists for a very long time that people who live in the land and live amongst trees and plant, and especially agriculturalists, have a very great deal of knowledge about plant names and plant properties and animal names and so on. But an important finding in that literature is that there's actually some pretty significant differences within the community. So for example, a simple example would be oftentimes women will have a different body of knowledge to men, because they will engage in a different set of practices around, for example, collecting as opposed to hunting. You know, so wherever you have a division of labor, you're also typically going to get, you know, and this research has shown that actually, you know, it's not just this group of people know different stuff to this other group of people, but they actually have differently structured taxonomies of the natural world, and they have different kind of, for example, the depth of their hierarchies of hierarchical understanding of the natural world. And so I think it would be grounded in exactly the kind of thing that you're saying about your dad. So I would, you know, speculate that he just didn't engage in activities where he was coordinating around differences in tastes of wine with people that he with. But he would actually make a point of talking about coffee or going to places where he'd like to get coffee or buying coffee from a particular supplier. I don't know, buying coffee paraphernalia. And these things put you in a context where you're actually motivated to attend to those differences and to coordinate with others around them.
Well, he drank about 15 cups a day of coffee, but he drank very little wine. So, I mean, that's a big part of it, like you said. So yeah, these are really, he cared about it, yeah. But I mean, but it's also if you have experiences, you know, if you, like you said, what you're doing. Even one thing I noticed in going like in the jungle with Rawang informants who were hunters is they not only made distinctions, but could find them very easily. They were more salient to them in the wild. In other words, they could see things I couldn't see even. So like you said, somehow they're having that ability to distinguish things, maybe, I don't know, allowed them to pick them out more easily, or is it just a more...
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it sort of seems like a case of training, you know, basic training. But my point here is that, you know, and I think we've all had that experience when we go to another culture and we go amazed that people see these things that we weren't seeing. But I think any learning process is kind of like that. You know, when you go to the next level and the next level and the next level in learning something like, say, music, for example, you learn to be able to wield ideas that you couldn't wield before, and you learn
Right.
to be able to chunk information that you couldn't chunk before, and notice distinctions you couldn't notice before. And my view of that would be that you're cultivating that capacity, but not in a private way. You're cultivating it through coordinating around those distinctions in interaction with others. So through, through, let's say you're learning piano or something, you're having lessons, you're talking with people about what you're hearing, and so on.
Very good. We have another question on the chat. How is what you are proposing here related to the ideas of complex adaptive systems?
Yeah, I wish I knew. I mean, I'm not really au fait with complex adaptive systems. Perhaps you could tell us more specifically. Do you see a relation? Do you see a link there that you think would be worth exploring?
Are you asking Weyer Comer? You want
yeah, potentially if Weyer wants to elaborate. But I mean,
yeah.
I think one thing, I mean, in that general area of complex systems, I think that it is related. I mean, you put complex adaptive systems with capital letters, so you might have something very specific in mind. But in terms of, I mean, what I'm thinking maybe more about is the relationship between the kind of micro and the macro level, which is often a matter of interest when people are looking at how systems behave and about how groups can coordinate in their behavior. So for example, groups, oftentimes you look at a system like an ecology or a flock of birds or something like that. And for us, the question is, how do you link the micro level, individual, so like with the termite nests, right, you have to link the individual behavior of a single termite, who's a standalone agent with its own inputs and outputs. How do you link that to the the actual finished product, which can never be built by one single termite? And with human language, it's a similar thing. So somehow we are, as a population, we're sustaining these very complex, very rich systems of conception, of activity, of meaning, and somehow as individuals we have to play a part in that, and that's kind of what I'm really focusing on here. So I suppose if there was a relation to that type of question about complex adaptation in systems, it would be that, yes, I think what I'm talking about is trying to causally link individuals' experience and behavior to kind of population level outcomes.
But that is the definition. What you were talking about is the definition of a complex adaptive system, where you have a lot of agents doing something, but the sum of what they're doing is greater than, the totality of what they're doing is greater than the sum of their parts. It emerges out of their interactions, but it's not necessarily what they intended. So like the path that you talked about in the grass, that's actually a complex adaptive system, because the people just trying to get from point A to point B, and a lot of people walking across that path wears away the grass. But it's not that they tried to create a path. It's just that they're doing that action. All these different people doing that action created the phenomenon, which is the path. And so that's actually that's considered a complex adaptive system. And language, like you said, has been talked about quite a bit as a complex adaptive system, because we're not trying to create language. We are trying to communicate, just like an economy is a complex adaptive system. We're not trying to create an economy. We're trying to just do our individual barter or whatever. And then the economy arises as a side product of that. Or a traffic jam is also a complex adaptive system, because people are trying to just get from point A to point B, but the traffic jam just emerges out of that collectivity of activity.
Yeah, so I think the thing that I'm interested in trying to draw out here is not just to describe language in that way, but to think about language in that way in order to come up with accounts of the causes. What I've called elsewhere the natural causes of language, the causal processes by which we can actually maintain language. So oftentimes in looking at these complex systems, there is one of the problems is how much information do you have to put into the system to get it to operate in the right way? And in nature, like with the termites, often you've got very minimal specifications, very minimal kind of requirements at the individual level, but taken together, they, this much more complex thing emerges. And so it's a trade-off. Yeah, I guess I'm looking to understand the causal relations implicit.
Well, that's the problem with complex adaptive systems, is you cannot identify simple causation. So that's why they're called complex, is because the causality is not a simple thing. It's not like where, in physics or chemistry, where you can just put this thing and this thing together and you definitely can predict what the outcome is going to be. It's
right.
not
So
predictable.
maybe I was just a little bit, maybe that was not, I could have been said that a bit more cautiously, but I guess what I mean is not necessarily saying what the causes are, but saying what the elements would be of a causal account. So what would the, how many pieces would you have to specify, or how many values would you have to specify in the system in order to get it to emerge in the way it did? And as we know from, historical linguistics and the history of cultures and so on, you can't predict how starting conditions would end up later on. But what you can do is give some account for what the mechanisms would be, and how they're likely to go, I would hope.
Right. But even that, like Trudgill has talked about how, we normally have this uniformity principle, of Lebov's uniformity principle, that we assume that language has always been the same going back. But actually, Trudgill has been arguing that no, actually in primitive, very small group society, it actually might have been very different. So you really can't necessarily, the uniformity principle may not always hold in all contexts. So it may be difficult to actually know where it started, or even from a retrospective view, never mind from going from that period forward.
Is he proposing, I'm not sure what, I haven't read what it is you refer to, but is he proposing that there could have been such a thing as a simple language, like really orders simpler than?
No, just that the nature of the society, because, he's talked a lot about what he calls sociolinguistic typology. So he's talking a lot about how the structure of the society itself influences the type of language structures you're going to have and things like that. So now that we have much more complex societies, we might have a very different type of language situation as compared to a very small group, hunter-gatherer type society.
Okay, so yeah, I understand now what you're referring to, but I think that it would not predict, it would obviously predict that you'd have differences in languages based on, social organization, but it wouldn't predict that you'd have like literally a primitive language.
No, I don't think it means that. But there may be certain features of the languages that would be different. I can send you his article. It's from the book. I think one place he talks about it is the book I did with Rick on non-linguistic influence on linguistic structures. That book, 2015. Yeah. I can send you the
highly recommended. So those of you who haven't read that.
Okay, there should be some other questions. We got 54 people in there. Come on. I don't want to dominate this. Okay, all right, here we go. You've talked about coordination, norms, and identity. Do you acknowledge any importance to the indexicality of signifiers? For example, what type of person uses the signifier, in what context it is used? And if so, do you think indexicality should be described in grammars?
Yeah, thank you for this question. Yeah, I mean, I certainly acknowledge the importance of the indexicality of signifiers. I've been involved with working with linguistic anthropologists over the years, and, indexicality is their thing. That's the thing that they're especially interested in. And of course, sociolinguistics very much concerned with, not just the structures of language, but what one can signal about oneself by choosing certain structures. So in fact, the last piece of the talk just now was about what you can index about your identity. So I would, view that as being an indexical effect. I mean, indexicality is a very, very all-pervasive and powerful kind of semiotic principle. So you might mean a few different things by indexicality. But in your question, you know, you mentioned, for example, the type of person using the signifier, the context in which it's used. Absolutely. I mean, I think those are crucial for understanding, you know, the proper conditions of use and the effects of use. All of those things would fall under indexicality for sure. The last part of your question is really interesting, you know, whether indexicality should be described in grammars. In part, obviously, the answer is yes, insofar as many grammatical systems have indexical aspects to their nature. So, you know, demonstrative systems are indexical sort of inherently. Pronoun systems operate indexically in texts, you know, tense marking, all of these things have indexical components because they're setting up a relationship between two things, or between the speech and the context, or two parts of a text, and this kind of thing. So I think actually indexicality is already being described in grammars in a standard sense, but I think you mean something broader than that, and sort of, for example, should grammars have a section about, you know, the sociolinguistic variation within a community, or these types of things. And I mean, I think it's a hard question to answer because I don't know. So I remember my colleague once saying to me, you know, that he thought, so Bill McGregor saying to me that he thought that if you really wanted to write a comprehensive grammar of a language, you'd need, you know, 10 volumes. And that probably wouldn't even be enough, you know. So in a theoretical sense, the sort of blue sky sense, the answer to your question is yes, we should put absolutely every piece of information we possibly can about the language in the grammar. But practically speaking, you know, as Bill said, I mean, it's rare to find a language that is more than one volume, let alone 10. And I don't know, like average kind of grammar is going to be 400 or 500 pages in length. Some are longer than that, some are shorter. So there are obviously very real practical constraints on continuing to add more information. So for now, I'd rather somebody write a grammar and put it out than wait until they could, you know, have a whole bunch of chapters on, you know, all the things we wish that we could put into grammars. So the answer to your question is kind of hard to answer in the abstract. The answer is it would be good, but it's hard to do.
Might relate to how much it influences the actual grammatical, say, constructions that you're talking about. So you may need to bring that in if there are variant constructions, and then you need
that's
to
a good point. So yeah, I think that you would find that in a good grammar of like any good grammar, it's a very good point that sometimes grammatical constructions. So I remember learning about English that you know, this shirt needs pressed is something that you can say in certain parts of the States, but I never heard it in my life before. I would have to say this shirt needs to be pressed or something like that, or needs pressing. And so, you know, that's a sociolinguistic variable in the States. It's been studied, and so yeah, you know, that's an example of, I think, what Randy was just suggesting, is that you would probably want to note down when. Yeah, I think so. So you know,
honorifics.
Yeah, that's another one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
So like in Japanese, there's actually no neutral, you know, verb form. You have to pick one. And so you have to always be aware of the context that you're and who you are, who the other person is, and whatnot, in order to use the right
construction. Yeah, those types of distinctions would be much more pervasive in everyday speech, of course, those kinds of languages. Yeah.
Okay. Any other comments, questions? Or I hope there are some comments, questions.
I would be interested if I could just, I mean, it's a bit hard in this context to ask. I would probably, you know, ask people to put up their hands, but maybe just something to think about.
You can actually do that. Yes, people have put up hands, I think.
Well, let me just ask my question anyway. I mean, I'm kind of now very intrigued by this discovery very late in my life, that there are people, not just individuals, but whole communities, it seems, who don't know what I'm talking about when I refer to déjà vu, which to me is this fundamental human experience. And I still find it deeply puzzling that when I talk to people in Laos and I describe the experience of déjà vu, they literally don't know what I'm talking about. So that should imply that there's lots of people in the world who similarly don't know what déjà vu. They don't just lack a word for it, but they don't know what it is. And that then leads to the realization that there's a million other things like that that I also don't know what they are, right? Deep experiences that other people in the world have that assume are just universally human because they're shared in their community. But I, don't have that experience whatsoever. So, if anybody's out there studying déjà vu or, interested in looking into it, I think it'd be really interesting to do something cross-linguistic or just cross-cultural about, what percentage of communities in the world actually have this concept and recognize it. So get in touch with me if you want to do a study on it. How about that?
So David Nash asks, what did English used to call déjà vu before they borrowed the French, I guess it means.
Yeah, that's a really good question, David.
Did they have the concept before they borrowed it? Yeah, before they borrowed the word, I mean. That's a good question.
I haven't looked into it, but it's a question. If this is the David Nash that I think it is, there's a question that comes up often in discussions of universals of human language. So, for example, in discussions around the proposals of universals by Anna Wijbitska and her colleagues, they might say, okay, for example, the word for body is a universal human concept, and all languages have this word. And if or other examples are the same, you can find languages where that word is actually a borrowing into the language. It's borrowed from some neighboring language. And this same exact question comes up. What did people used to call it? Or was it the case that they never actually had that concept? So it really isn't universal. It's only universal because, at a certain point recently, people adopted this word. So, I mean, it's surely an empirical question, and, maybe somebody's answered it. I mean, it's true that in French, it is, it has this sort of literal meaning, but when we use it in that routine where we say, well, it's really, I guess I've been thinking a little bit about it. There's two ways in which we use it nowadays. One is where we literally have this experience and we mention to our friends, oh, I'm having déjà vu, this is so weird. But the other context is more metaphorical, where we say, oh, this is déjà vu. They did the same thing last year, or this happens every election or whatever. So it's sort of more of a metaphorical thing. Yeah.
Yogi Berra, it's déjà vu all over again.
Yeah, exactly. Déjà vu again. And I agree, actually. I just see now Connor's comment about the Matrix scene. So, it's a cultural reference. And for those of you who haven't seen the Matrix or don't remember the scene is where, they're essentially in this computer program, and the character sees this cat and then sees the same cat come again in exactly the same way. And he says, I'm having déjà vu. And they say, oh, no, that's a glitch in the Matrix. And it happens when they, change the program or something. So, yeah, it's not actually a very good illustration, because with real déjà vu, you don't see the same thing happen immediately afterwards. It's different from that. You're experiencing something now, and you have this very strong sense that you've experienced it before sometime in the past.
Right. Yeah, that's good. Jesse says it's funny because déjà vu just means to have already seen in French. So I don't know if that's actually a concept in French, or it's just, they talked about it that way. In Chinese, you also say something like, 即视感, which is a feeling of having seen it before. So is that, but I guess it's just labeling a feeling that you have, whether or not they had it before contact, because our cultures have been so much in contact. it's hard to say whether we borrowed it or had it originally. But
right. Here's another comment.
Okay, it's a chicken and egg question, but it's possible that there was no equivalent before the word was adopted. Some say the phrase child abuse created the awareness to the issue.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I think that, you know, I've used a phrase a little bit, the phrase to, you know, the idea that people coordinate around things, then they use words to coordinate around certain common, you know, moorings. And so this is an interesting case. So if you say that the term child abuse was created, that the term child abuse created awareness of a certain issue, I think that's you know, clearly possible. It would do so through enabling people to coordinate around that specific idea. So,
Right.
you know, we can assume that child abuse, you know, has occurred as long as there have been children, sadly. But referring to it in a particular way and having a category and a
Right.
concept for it is not just having a concept, but it's having something that people can coordinate around in their behavior. They can use it in those actions like holding someone to account, or explaining someone's behavior, or predicting someone's behavior, or warning people, or, you know, all sorts of actions that they're then able to perform socially by virtue of having that term. And so, I mean, I think it's very clear in some cases what the payoff is socially of having a word for something. With other cases, it's less clear. So the case with the routine of announcing that you're having déjà vu in English, it's really unclear what the function of it is, because it doesn't have any consequences. You just get on with the conversation. You know, you can't, the feeling goes away quickly, and it's just like a little bit of turbulence. My only hypothesis about that is that it's the kind of thing that you might say as a way of just revealing an inner experience you have, and thereby displaying some sense of intimacy with the people that you're with. But I don't know if that's a very strong intuition, because I feel like I would probably tell, I wouldn't only tell my sort of intimate family members that I was having déjà vu. It's maybe just a sense of informality of the interaction or something like that.
But what you were talking about there, I think is very true, that it would have to be, you have some kind of experience, and then somebody gives it a name, and then other people, like you said, fill in that, you know, it's the name kind of draws them to fill in that concept. So I think of selfie like really spread like fire, you know, very quickly through the community, because we'd all been doing something like that, but didn't have a name for it. But once we had the name for it, not only the name, but the activity itself, like you said, following on from having that concept, it leads you to some activity. So people say, yeah, let's take a selfie. And then everybody knows what to do when they say, let's take a selfie. So that's a really good example of what you're talking about.
I think so. Yeah, it's a good one. Yeah, it's a good case of stigmergy, actually, because, you know, the practice itself creates a trace of the activity by virtue. I mean, it's sort of an archetypal version of creating a trace of the activity is the photograph itself. And then you see that, and then you go, oh, that's what people do. You know, I'll go do that in the right context. Yeah, good case.
Yeah. Okay, we got another one. Thank you very much for organizing this to everyone. And thanks, Nick, for a very interesting talk. What a great way to start a Monday morning with a cup of coffee in Finland. Got to teleport to the next meeting. Stay safe, all.
Yeah, it's good to see you. Thanks for tuning in. I'm very grateful. Nice to see you, Pat. I'm very grateful for people tuning in, not only from Singapore, but as we can see, from all around the world. It's terrific.
Yeah, from Finland.
Yeah,
very
I'm really
good.
grateful.
Yeah, that's very good. Okay. It's a little bit over our originally scheduled time, but if anybody has any more comments, questions, please submit that. I'm sorry we didn't just open the mic to everybody, but with a lot of people, I just thought it would be easier to coordinate this way. Okay, well, if there are no more comments or questions, then, oh, wait, we got a long one here. Regarding the wine lingo, alongside this use of fanciful language by connoisseurs to express oneself and knowledge as a server, I observe that customers also ask about wine, beer, etc., in hopes that their server will provide that fanciful language so that they might feel included in this cosmopolitan world. This is a good point. So even when people don't know the topic, or rather the language used to talk about it, and even express that they don't by asking about it, they show that they still desire some degree of access to the social sphere, which is achieved by becoming familiar with the relevant linguistic forms. Here, language, specifically lexical constructions such as BlackBerry Courants, sell themselves well enough as real knowledge or real identity. This also brings up the topic of mental spaces, in that people can hear BlackBerry Courants and reuse it to impress their friends without having empirical knowledge of it. There is therefore functional knowledge about the construction if an empirical one lacks. Right, okay, thanks, right. Connor. Sorry to make you type all of that. We could have just let you open the mic, but that's a really good comment. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a terrific comment, and yeah, I think it really draws attention to one of the key points that I keep wanting to stress, and that is that, when we're talking about word meanings, it's not just about what the word refers to, it's about what we can do with the word, what the word itself, achieves for us, and what incentives, I get to use that word. So I think this is a really good example where, a person wants to be part of that world in which that word is being used. And it may well be that once you get into that world for real, you begin to, perceive tastes you couldn't perceive before, and so on. I think that's highly possible, but you certainly have that transitional period or that middle ground where, you might be bluffing in some sense. So I think it's a really good comment. Thank you.
Good. If anybody else has longer comments and don't want to type it, they're welcome to open their mic and say something. Just thank you. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Nick. This has been really great. I've really learned a lot myself, and I really appreciate you doing this on a Monday morning, or for you, Monday afternoon, I guess.
Afternoon. Yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, take care then. And we have recorded this, so we're going to be posting this online, which you already agreed to. Just to let everybody know, I'm not just stealing your thunder or something, that you agreed to us, because there are people in the US who would like to watch this, and but they still want to get their beauty sleep. All right. Of course. And we got a few thanks coming in.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate it. So thanks, everyone.
Okay. All right. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
In Singapore.
Yeah.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.